Alright, so I'm gonna attempt to finish this. Hopefully, I don't feel too rushed within my schedule. Okay, so I'm back with the birth, earth, aging, and the economy. So, the evidence. As we examine the facts, we look at the United States and at 10 European nations in the forefront of the demographic changes that have caused concern. The population projections used are the same as those underlying the present gloomy forecast of long-term economic stagnation. What has been the historical relation between population growth and economic growth? If population growth were a major factor influencing economic growth, then one might expect to find that higher population growth and higher economic growth together. Is this in fact the case? Figure 1 presents growth rates since 1870 of population and real per capita income for each of the 11 countries. Average growth rates over 4 long periods are given. The periods are those identified by the Angus Maddison in his book Phases of Capitalist Development, 1982, as development phases common to these countries, except that the most recent period in his history, 1973 1979, has been updated to cover 1973 to 1986. Studying the figure, one notes that fluctuations in the two series go together in most countries. Conceivably, one might seize on this to argue that declines in population growth cause declines in per capita income growth, but this is to argue that the tail wags the dog. Note, oh, rate of growth of GDP per capita solid line and population dotted line, specified country and period 1870 1986 percent per year. All right. So note that in all countries, the swings in population growth rates are quite small compared to those per capita income growth. Even more doubt uh, about the importance of population growth in determining economic growth arises when one compares long-term trends in two series. While population growth has trended downward in most of these countries over the last century, real per capita growth has trended upward. Typically, the two post 1950 observation on real GDP per capita in Figure 1 included even that for the recently relatively depressed period 1973 to 1986 lie in above those for the two earlier periods. In contrast, the post-1950 rates of population growth are about the same as or lower than the pre-1950s rates. This inverse association between trends in economic growth and population growth is contrary to what one would have expected if declining population growth were exerted a serious drag on the economy. How sizable are projected declines in population growth compared with the past experience? The population growth rates projected for these countries in the next century are, in fact, not a great deal different from their current rates. The average annual growth rate of the population in 1973 to 1986 was only 0.3%. The projected growth rate as its lowest for the period of 2030 to 2050 average, negative 0.3%, United Nations 1988. The prospective decline in population growth rates is thus, on average, 0.6 percentage points over an interval of 6 decades, or a tenth of a percentage point per decade. As we have just seen, per capita income growth has trended upward in these countries, while population growth has tended downward. It is hard to believe that such a modest further decline in the rate of population growth would in itself produce a dramatic adverse departure from the historic patterns of secularly rising per capita income growth. Uh, so I'm curious about this too, actually, because usually data will point all over the place in different directions. So, how sizable are projected increases in the overall dependency burden compared with past experiences? The dependency burden is sometimes discussed as though it compromises elderly dependents alone, but it is obviously that the burden of dependency on the working age population involves infants and children as well as older dependents. Thus, to put dependency changes in proper perspective, one needs to look at the size of the entire dependent population, young and old, relative to the working age population. To this end, Figure 2 presents for the same 11 countries since 1880 the ratio to the working age population age 15 to 64 of the sum of the two dependent age groups, persons under age 15 and over the age of 64. Subsequently, we will consider two age groups separately. The vertical broken line in each panel is at 1990, separating actual experience from projected. The horizontal line in each panel, about which most of the curves fluctuate, is at a value of 0.6, indicating that on average in this period there were about 0.6 dependents per member of the working age population. How sizable is the prospective increase in dependency when viewed in historical perspective? Figure 2 shows a projected peak in dependency for all of the countries in 2040, half a century hence. How does the height of this peak compare with the highest level reached in the past century? In 3 centuries, France, Germany, and Switzerland, the projected peak is clearly higher. In 3 others, Norway, United Kingdom, and the United States, clearly lower. And in the rest, it is about the same. On average, the total dependency rate in these advanced industrial countries will about match its historic high in the period since 1880. The projected levels in 2040 are clearly higher than those prevailing at the current time, and it is this contrast that gives rise to much of the current concern. But extending the period of comparison backward a full century, one finds that in only 3 of the countries is projected dependency higher than in the past. Moreover, in no case does the projected high fall outside of the past century's experience of these countries taken as a whole. The highest projected ratios are somewhat less than 0.8, as was true of the highest ratios in late 19th century. Thus, the outlook for the total dependency burden, when viewed against the experience of the past century, is not unprecedented. This conclusion holds under a variety of sensitivity tests for varying the concept of dependency. For example, instead of population ratios, using net workers to workers does not alter the picture, nor does focusing on the highly dependent population, that is, old plus young, neither do changes in the source used for the projections, OECD, UN, IMF, etc., nor does allowance for wide variation in immigration. Among current projections, the only case in which total dependency would rise to levels unprecedented in the past century is that which assumes a mortality revolution at the oldest ages. Although this possibility cannot be wholly ruled out, it is not this projection that underlies current gloomy accounts of the economic impact of population aging. Rather, such accounts are based on more moderate mortality projections on which the projection used in Figure 2 are based. Okay, so looking back at Figure 2. Total dependency ratio, actual and projected, specified country 1880 to 2050 ratio of persons age 0 to 14, age 65 plus, to those age 15 to 64. Sheesh. Alright. What has been the historical relation between the dependency burden and the rate of economic growth? Figure 3 bears on the relation between the dependency burden and the rate of economic growth. It is designed to assess whether increases in the dependency rate has been associated with decreases in the rate of economic growth. The four time periods used in Figure 1 are again used here: 1870 to 1913 through 1973 to 1986. As can be seen, although growth of the total output (GDP per capita), the solid line has varied markedly from one period of economic growth to another. The total dependency rate, the dotted line, has not. In most of the countries, the dependency rate is highest in the period 1870 to 1913. Thereafter, it is fairly stable. Figure 3. In the post-World War II period, the contrast is dramatic. Growth rate of per capita income in the period of 1950 to 1973 were almost double those from 1973. 1970. Oh, so this almost seems like the date that Roe was enacted, and so this sort of connects with their paranoia about aging populations. So this is interesting a little bit to 1986. Average 3.5 versus 1.9%. In contrast, in almost all of the countries, the dependency rate was nearly the same in two periods. The 11 country average was, in fact, virtually identical, 0.55 versus 0.54. One would be hard put to argue that dependency had much to do with the dramatic post-1973 drop in economic growth rates, and not surprisingly, it is never mentioned in scholarly attempts to explain this decline. What does the prospective rise in old age dependency imply for the tax burden on the working age population? So it is, there's a lot of debates lately about who started the decline in the population first. Was it the left? Was it the right? Was it just general policy? Or is it just outsourcing? Based on my research, I honestly think most of it is outsourcing, and so we're unable to do it. So, at the same time, they never really wanted us to have bodily autonomy, so you slowly outsource it while we pretend that we have our rights. So, alright. As shown in Figure 4, youth dependency is trending downward. Oh, sorry. What does the prospective rise in old age dependency imply for the tax burden on the working age? Okay, although overall dependency will not be so much different, the prospective age composition of dependency will be, as shown in Figure 4, youth dependency is trending downward and old age dependency upward, seen in conjunction with the total dependency trend. This shift, so obviously with not enough youthful people to take care of the elderly, this is the general idea, which is true. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything malicious to it, but with our outsourcing and smaller families, it's harder to take care of the elderly. So, and plus with our rights of abortion that we just recently got taken away, we've always sort of been slowly being outsourced in terms of our labor at home and our scheduling that is slowly being sort of more hectic by the year. So obviously the youth won't pay for this because we're having less children. It's the elderly that will pay. And so, I don't know. Take that with what you will. As shown in Figure 4, youth dependency is trending downward and old age dependency upward, seen in conjunction with the total dependency trend. This shift, I'll go up to those graphs in a bit, puts in a rather different light the issue of prospective burden on the working population of rising old age dependency. Clearly, a declining burden of youth dependents compensates for the growing burden of older dependents. Analysts of government spending sometimes recognize this by noting that the offset to rising government retirement and health spending provided by declining education expenditures. But this relevant comparison must go beyond this to consider the full economic cost per dependent, that is, the private as well as public costs of supporting infants and children compared with the elderly. If the working age population needs to spend less out of its income to support children, then more funds are potentially available for supporting other dependents. It is one thing to count heads and compare the number of younger versus older dependents. It is another to assess the full economic cost of supporting an average younger versus older dependent. Clearly, the standard of support for both children and older dependent is socially, not physiologically determined. Moreover, there is the need to consider non-market production and consumption of the two groups. Indeed, it is because of the ambiguity of regarding costs of dependents that it is important to have a clear picture of the number of younger versus older dependents, as in Figure 4. Okay, Figure 4. Alright. So looking at Figure 3, because I skipped through this along with Figure 4, obviously. Alright. The amount of empirical work that has actually been done on relative costs of the two groups is small, but what has been done suggests the economic cost per dependent, private plus public, are in fact not much different for older and younger dependents. If this is so, then the economic burden of dependency on the working age population is unlikely to be noticeably higher in the first half of the 21st century than in the 20th century, since the increased cost of supporting a larger proportion of older dependents will be offset by the decreased cost of supporting a smaller proportion of younger dependents. This implies that the real issue to be faced is largely political, namely how to capture via taxation the savings of households from supporting fewer younger dependents, so that these funds can be used to meet the rise in public expenditures needed to support older dependents. The question of political feasibility is a serious one, but it does not seem unsurmountable, given that the workers to be taxed would themselves currently beneficiaries of such taxation. Sorry. In any event, the issue is clearly different from the suggested by the view that the prospective economic burden on workers of supported dependents will somehow be unprecedented. This does not seem to be the case. But what about the implications for the prospective tax burden on the working age population? Clearly, the public expenditures grow relative to the GNP over the long run. So too will taxes. For one thing, as was noted, increased public spending on the retirement and healthcare would be partly offset by the decreased public spending for schooling, hence the net increase in public spending and thus in tax would be less than the increase in retirement and health spending. Moreover, as shown in the Table 1, projections to 2040 by OECD for most of the countries covered here, using the present demographic scenario, indicate that the quite modest average annual growth rate of real earnings between 0.3-0.8% would suffice to keep the tax burden per head of the working age population in 2040 at the same level as in 1980. This growth rate earnings is well below the experience in the past. This projection assumes no change in benefit levels for the older population, but it also fails to allow for the fact that the taxable capacity for the working age population would be enhanced by fewer younger dependents per worker and higher labor force participation of females. Nor is there any allowance for the possible peace dividend due to the end of the Cold War. Thus, it seems unlikely that there would be adverse incentive effects because of the undue tax burden associated with population aging. Okay, so yeah, initially there would be a boom in population or a boom in economic development because more women are working, but that also means later children in life. And so this is true, but this becomes a how we react to this situation, not the fact that women just want to work and have later children in life and that this is actually a scheme on their bodies. So, like the fact that that's not really it's not really up for debate, you know? So, reallocating this debate to what we can change, which is taking away rights, essentially. Uh, so, how sizable is the prospective aging of the labor supply, and what does it imply for the overall education level of the labor supply? What is the outlook? Oh, sorry. What is the outlook for the age composition of the working age population itself? Will there be, as some have argued, a disproportionate number of older workers and a consequent possible decline in innovation, mobility, and thus productivity growth? To assess this question, Figure 5 presents data from 1880 through 2025 for the ratio of the population aged 20 to 34 to the aged 35 to 64, that is, the younger working age population relative to the older. The trend in this ratio is clearly downward. There will be relatively fewer younger and more older workers. In more countries, however, the projected level around 2025 is not much below that around 1960. World Bank projections, which have ratios for 2025, much like those shown here, imply an increase to 2050 in the proportion of the young in all of the countries, ranging from 2 to 10% points, as lower birth rate cohorts replace higher birth rate cohorts at age 35 to 64. Thus, while a relative scarcity of younger workers for supply of older workers is in prospect for the first quarter of the next century, it is not greatly out of line with the degree of scarcity experienced with 3 decades ago, and it is projected to lessen between 2025 and 2050. Alright, Table 1. So, Belgium, required growth rate 1980 to 2040, 0.2. Actual growth rate, oh, okay. Sources column calculated from, hold on, just reading to myself here. Oh, well, this is interesting. The OECD projection is based on the demographic projections underlying Figure 2 and an assumption of the constant age, sex, specific labor force participation rate. Column 2, compensation per employees in the business sector as related in OECD 1990, adjusted by the Consumption Price Index, OECD various dates. The period used for the actual growth rate is the longest for which historical OECD rates are available. United States data are since 19 oh sorry, United States data are since 1948. Okay. What about the impacts of labor supply aging on the educational attainment of the labor force? In considering this, one should note that in a number of these countries, the educational level of the older working age population will improve substantially over the next 30 years as those who benefited from the pre-1970s upsurge of schooling. Alright. Oof. Netherlands just looks like it took like this crash. That's that's rough. Upsurge in schooling reached older ages. Table 2 shows the prospective changes in educational attainment of older workers implied by recent census data. If schooling of young continues to stagnate as it did in the 1970s, OECD 1983 to 1984, the average level of the education of the labor force as a whole would nevertheless be higher, as less educated older cohorts are replaced by better educated ones. If schooling of the young resumes its prior uptrend, then the average education of the labor force will rise even more. In either event, the favorable trend in educational attainment in the older ages will offset the supported adverse effects of aging on the education of the labor supply. I assume this is talking about like education like in the subject matter to get society running, not just like, hey, I know some math. Now, obviously, college, you sort of need to do the four horsemen, you know. Anyways, This is a tendency to think of older population in terms of the low educational levels that prevailed in the past. It is time to recognize that in many countries, older workers will be much better educated than heretofore, and not much different in the educational level for younger workers. In the future, the generally higher educated level of older workers and possibly younger workers as well should be an important factor. Among the greater experience of older workers compensating for the negative effects, if any, of aging on innovation and mobility. The outlook for the birth earth. So far, the analysis has accepted without question the view embodied in current population projections that fertility will remain quite low, perhaps declining further or rising to near replacement levels at most. But how good are these projections? To answer this, one might reasonably ask, did population forecast foresee either the enormous population World War II baby boom or a subsequent baby bust? The answer is no. While the baby boom was taking off in the late 1940s, population forecasters were still predicting a continuation of the low fertility rates of the 1930s. Eventually, in the 1950s, with the baby boom at full throttle, forecasters abandoned their low fertility projections for high fertility forecasts, only to be caught by surprise once again as fertility started to plunge in the 1960s. In the last 2 decades, as fertility rates plummeted to new lows in advanced industrial countries, forecasters have switched back to low fertility assumptions, as in the forecast we have just been examining. How much faith can we put in the current projections? Not much. Rather than predicting the future, fertility projections basically track the recent past. Instead of admitting this, however, forecasters typically try to buttress their projections with supporting judgments. The latest United States Census Bureau high fertility projections foresees an average rate of childbearing only slightly above replacement, about 2.2 births per woman. In commenting on this, the Bureau assures us, quote, it is clearly possible that fertility might eventually surpass this level, but this does not seem likely given the social, economic, and demographic trends of the last 2 decades. U.S. Bureau of the Census 1989. Similarly, in the recent volume, authoritatively entitled Future Demographic Trends in Europe and North America, the United States nation's 1988 high projections of the total fertility rate, which also reaches an eventual mean value of about 2.2 for industrial countries, is determined as too high and not very probable. Instead, the other opts for high fertility rates considerably below replacement level as more probable, on average of about 1.6 to 1.9 parts per woman. Such statements have a familiar ring. Over 4 decades ago, in 1948, the then leading American scholarly demographic publication opined regarding future fertility rates that, quote, the range of uncertainties between rates of somewhat below replacement and rates slightly above such replacement, Population Index 1948. Needless to say, this statement was made after the post-World War II American baby boom was underway, when fertility soared far above replacement levels. A similar fate may be in store for the more recent statements quoted above. As shown in Table 3, in a number of advanced industrial economies, the total fertility rate in 1990 was noticeably above its 1980s trough. In none was it below. The U.S. Census Bureau's high population of total births in 1990, published in 1989, was over 5% below actual experience, even allowing for the fact that the work on the public projection was completed in 1987. How could the high projection fall so short in only 3 years? Indeed, although the latest recession has put the usual damper on fertility, total births in 1991 were again above high projections of the Census Bureau by almost 4%, compared with the median projections that used in the forecast here. Births in 1990 and 1991 averaged almost 12% higher than projected. Alright, table 3. Whoa. Oh, Sweden's doing pretty good. Clearly, the fertility experience of the past few years here and abroad hints at the possibility of new fertility upward. Historically, experience does provide a basic for projecting on upturn in fertility. If we extend our historical perspective beyond the past 2 decades, we find that over the past century there has been a long-term swing in fertility rates in almost all advanced industrial countries. This is this is illustrated by estimates of completed fertility presented in Table 4. Typically, the initial trough uh, occurs among women born near the beginning of the century, and the subsequent peak among those born in the early 1930s. Although completed fertility for most women born in the 2 decades after World War II is not yet exactly known, the projected figures for women born in 1950 who are now very close to the end of their childbearing are very similar to those of the cohorts born at the beginning of the century. A new upswing would extend this pattern nicely, although the historical record does not provide that fertility will increase as in the past. Recent experience hints at this. Certainly, the historical record suggests that an increase in fertility is a possibility that forecasters ought at least to recognize. This, this possibility finds further support when we consider the prospective labor market for young adults in the coming decade. The numbers of those who will be reaching the childbearing age will be unusually low, an echo of the recent baby bust. Also, immigration from low-income countries in Europe is likely to be increasingly restricted. Other things constant, this scarcity of younger workers will make for a favorable labor market for adults in the family formation ages, the reversal of the situation experienced by these predecessors, the baby boom cohorts. The biggest conjectural factor is the growth rate of aggregate demand. The prospective reduction in military outlays, the subsequent easing of spending pressures on government budgets, give some basis for thinking there may be a return to the expensive monetary fiscal policies of the earlier post-World II era. Moreover, smaller numbers at the younger end of the labor market should make for more vigorous expansion of the aggregate demand for the monetary fiscal authorities by lowering the unprecedented rate corresponding to full employment. Jeez. If aggregate demand is expanded more rapidly, then demand side conditions will take a turn more favorable to young adults. Will take a turn more favorable to young adults. Although the outlook is uncertain, it hardly warrants dismissing the possibility of a strong labor market for young people that would induce a fertility upswing. I mean, if you fund them and take care of them and treat them with respect and make them think that they have the confidence that they can have a child safely. So, this is not the case, though. So, this is actually. The IMF is basically outsourcing everything and putting us all in debt for some reason. So, yeah, expansive. More like expensive. Jesus Christ. Okay. Ongoing rates of childbearing, historical fertility experience, and the prospective labor demand supply conditions for young adults thus suggest as a serious possibility a prospective upswing in fertility. If this possibility were introduced into projections, it would, of course, substantially alter the outlook for population growth and dependency rates. Over the next decade or two, population growth and dependency would be higher than now projected as the population under 18 grew more rapidly than expected. No doubt there would also be a renewed upsurge of fears about excessive population growth, but in the period when dependency is currently expected to reach projected highs after 2025, there would be a tendency for the dependency ratio to decline as the newest baby boom cohorts reached adulthood and expanded the numbers in working ages. Excessive population growth is taken care of in the third world, and we all know that. I'm just reiterating. So I don't know if it'll go over that, but it's definitely omitting it for sure. Like, I almost feel like it's less than a nod towards that, but history doesn't lie, though. Oh, wait. Well, that's stupid. History is pretty much written by the victors for the most part. National security pretty much covers its ass when it comes to projects like the West and Britain creating Israel. Okay, getting off topic here. While all of this is conjectural, it is hardly any more so than the prevailing consensus of the continued birth dearth. This consensus rests solely. Sorry, I read consensus and I thought I said something else. This consensus rests solely on the projection 6 decades hence of experience merely of the last 2 decades. It is hard to see why projections 60 years down the road should not be based on historical experience of at least comparable length. The possibility of the substantial fertility upswing would seem to deserve more weight in assessments of population projections than is given to it currently. Summary. The central question at issue here is whether demographic patterns projected for the future, low or negative population growth, and population aging, are likely to have important adverse effects on future economic growth. That is, whether the projected patterns of population growth imply secular stagnation on the economic side. To answer this, we have focused particularly on the record of the last century. As it turns out, historical experience raises serious doubts about the secular stagnation thesis. In the past, growth rates of real per capita income have trended upward despite the downward trend in population growth. So, this I believe this is usually to blame atheism on birth decline and thus like a white genocide myth, but um, money and power is like the usury is all Christianity, even though they sort of gave it to the Jews, but the rich Jewish or the rich Christian pastors and the rich priests that are on stage, so they act almost as a secular entity if we're only focusing on the money aspect of things. Because we like to think of money as the economy and that is separate from religion, but it's really not. Alright, where was I? Okay. This is hardly what one would expect if population growth were exerted a serious drag on the economy. Also, in post-World War II period, economic growth rates have differed sharply between periods with little or no differences in dependency. Nor are projected demographic changes markedly out of line with past experience. Future declines projected for the rate of population growth are quite small, hence it is hard to see why a substantial new negative effect on economic growth should emerge. Projections of aging of the labor market itself do not yield magnitudes of line with previous experience. Moreover, there will be a sharp increase in the educational attainment of older workers. Negative effects, if any, of labor force aging on innovation and mobility are likely to be offset by the markedly higher educational level of the older population, as well as the greater experience of older workers. So yes, pension reform can put you into just forever slavery, sure, but, we're sort of using automation at this point. So we're sort of phasing out the demographic necessity and using machines, even though you still need people to grease the machines. That's few and far in between compared to using a demographic dividend or something like that to increase the population, to keep the economy running, I mean. Alright. Similarly, the outlook of the total dependency burden on workers, when viewed in historical perspective, is not unprecedented. Projected total dependency rates are on average about the same as in the late 19th century, since rising old age dependency is projected to be offset by declining youth dependency. An assessment of the projected change in tax burden per worker suggests that this is not likely to be so great as to have serious adverse incentive effects. Indeed, the longer-term historical record raises doubt about fertility leveling off below replacement levels as currently projected. Completed fertility in this current century shows a current long-term swing of about 50 years duration. A labor market condition and labor market conditions are now emerging that favor a new upswing. In all of the countries considered here, the current total fertility rate is about its 1980s trough, and a number of the increase is sizable. If a new baby boom were to occur, it would change the dependency outlook in a more favorable direction in the period after 2025, the period when current projections place the dependency burden at its highest. It is hard to understand why the possibility of a new baby boom is so blandly dismissed in demographic projections. In the literature on less developed countries, recent years have seen a growing skepticism that population growth has important adverse effects on long-term economic growth. U.S. National Research Council 1986, it seems likely that a similar fate is in store for the current literature for foreseeing dire consequences for economic growth in the demographic outlook of developing countries. And if you actually look into it, 2025 is actually when a majority of the automation rollout will phase out a ton of our jobs, which is fascinating, honestly, because this does not foresee that. This doesn't even mention automation. So, most demographers probably had no idea that the elites were just going to give up, outsource, and automize, or turn everything into an automation economy, which is fascinating. That's amazing. All right. See you in the next one.